For today's watercolor tutorial, I'm going to show you guys how to draw and paint this adorable baby black bear. If you're just starting out in watercolor and feel a little intimidated, give it a try. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised by the simplicity of this painting. And if you're a more intermediate artist or you've already dabbled in watercolors for a while, this is also something you can take a step further and go as detailed as you want. So let's get started. So let's start with this sketch. I just have a piece of cheap printer paper and a mechanical pencil, and I'm starting with the tree and just drawing a slanted line for the tree. I'm making a little mark here in the center of the paper, which is marking the elbow of the bear. It's right in the middle. And then I'm just doing little curved candy cane shapes to complete the shape of the arm. For the head, it's just a circle, you guys, just a simple circle. And the ears are also just little half circles, one on each side. And it's an important thing to just check the distance between the ears and make sure that that's accurate. And then for the little bottom side of the bear, it comes down like a backwards J, and you can complete the inside of the knee and the little foot coming up. And then there's one little foot extending down below. So super simple, curvy shapes. The muzzle is about halfway down in the middle of that circle. And of course, you can see this first sketch was super rough. And now after I feel comfortable with my dimensions and my measurements, I'm going in and just tightening up the pencil sketch, being a little bit more careful with the finished markings here. But because this isn't the actual watercolor paper that I'm drawing the sketch on, I don't have to worry about erasing any lines or making sure that my edges are perfect. I'm actually going to be going over this again with transfer paper in order to get the drawing onto the watercolor paper. The nose is just a simple circle in the center of the muzzle with two little dots representing the nostrils. And the eyes are going to be really dark and in the shadows in the actual painting. So don't worry about going too detailed with these in the sketch. You can just do a filled in round circle for those eyes. And if you want to leave a little highlight, you can do that in the sketch too. Give them a couple little eyebrows. And then just tighten up the shape of the body. If it needs to go a little bit wider, a little more narrow, now is your chance to fix your drawing and make it really accurate. I realized that the elbow was a little too narrow, so I made it a little more wide and stretched it out into the body some more. And I'm just tightening up the edges around the front paw, adding a little bit of fur texture. This is really not necessary since, again, we're going to transfer the drawing to the paper. But you do want to get your claws accurate. Make sure that those little toes are drawn in just about right so that you can transfer those in an accurate way to your paper. Make sure that the size of the forearm is right. Just drawing in those back toes. Just little curved shapes, not too much detail. And remember that the bear's body is going to be very dark. We're going to be doing some drawing with the paint, but for the most part, it's just going to be a really dark blob almost. So don't worry if your drawing is not perfect. And you'll be adding some bark detail when you do the painting too. So there's our finished sketch. You can see that was pretty simple, just curved shapes. My paper today is Fabriano Artistico 140-pound cold pressed paper. It's on a block, so I can paint edge to edge without worrying about the paper warping or buckling under the water. I'm using my transfer paper with the shiny side down. And I place my drawing on top, and then I just trace right over the top of it. And this is going to transfer that drawing to the watercolor paper without having to do any erasing or anything like that. This is one advantage to doing your drawing ahead of time and just tracing it on. Once your drawing is transferred, you're ready to start painting. So I have a few colors here. I have indigo, burnt sienna, burnt umber, yellow ochre, buff titanium, and I have a brilliant, it's called cobalt teal blue. I'm starting with a wet and wet technique, and I just have a size 8 silver black velvet round brush. I'm taking clean water and painting it all over the background. In a case like this, the background is actually lighter than the subject matter of the painting. So I'm going to start with the light background and let it bleed into the bear just a little bit. We don't have to worry about any overlap, so you can see I'm painting the water over the edge slightly, and that's not a problem at all because the bear is going to be darker. So with a nice glossy surface, I'm mixing some water in with my cobalt teal blue, getting a nice juicy rich teal blue color and just dropping that in blobs all over the background. Grab more paint as needed, and I'm painting right up to that pencil edge. This yellow that you see on my palette is called Gamboge Nova. It's a Holbein color. It's a brilliant, warm yellow. And when I mix that with the bright teal, I get a luminous garden green, a yellowish green, and that's working out really nicely for my background. So I'm just mixing that in on areas of the paper where the cobalt teal blue didn't touch, and just allowing it to look like two different blended colors. They're blending together wet and wet. I'm not following my photo perfectly here. I'm not being super specific with my shapes. But I am working quickly because I want to take advantage of that wet paper and make sure that all these colors blend together with the wet and wet technique. Now I'm taking my Daniel Smith Indigo and just blocking in some darker shapes in the background, maybe suggesting some shadows in the woods. And I'm taking a little bit of the burnt umber and some of the indigo and creating this murky blackish mixture just for that background. You can see I'm moving my brush in almost a circular shape, and that's to try to simulate the look of a photograph that's sort of blurred out in the background. Oftentimes you'll see circular shapes in a blurry photo. So that's what I'm trying to mimic here. And you can see some of that paint is seeping into the bear, and that's totally okay. I actually want to encourage some of that blending so that when we do the bear's fur, it will look like it's overlapping into the background. Don't mess with your background too much, especially as it begins to dry. You'll want to leave it alone as things start to look like they're drying out, because then you run the risk of some cauliflower effect or backwash if you apply too much water to a background that's starting to dry. So just be aware of your timing with this. All right, with the background finished, I'm taking clean water in my brush again, and I'm going to do the tree trunk. Just a first layer here. So once again, just like we did with the background, I'm covering that whole shape with clean water. Working quickly, just trying to produce a nice glossy finish on the surface of the paper. I'm taking a little bit of that green mixture and painting it here in between the body of the bear and the tree, where the background is peeking through. And then while my background is at this little stage where it's almost dry but still wet, I'm adding a couple of little blooms. I'm taking my wet brush, just touching it to that wet surface, and you can see a couple of nice little blooms forming. Kind of a fun effect if you want to add that. I'm just playing with that shape a little bit to make it a little more pleasing and washed out. All right, so back to the tree trunk. Re-wetting it slightly since it began to dry, and now I'm taking my indigo and mixing it with the burnt umber. When you combine a dark blue and a dark brown, you get a nice black. So that's what I'm doing here, and just dropping that in a vertical brush stroke at the same slant that the tree is. And you can see I'm leaving some white in between these brush strokes. On the tree trunk in the reference photo, you can see that there are areas that are in shadow and areas that are in light. So these brush strokes are trying to mimic that and represent that as best as possible. Because we pre-wet the paper, we're getting nice soft edges. I'm going a little bit darker here, where there's a shadow cast by the bear's head. Look for those changes in value in your reference photo. Try to match them as much as you can. You'll notice I'm not painting right up to the edge here. I'm leaving it a little bit rough. And I'm dropping in little hints of that cobalt blue teal. And I'm painting a dark shadow right under the little bear's forearm. And I think that will suffice for the first layer for the tree. We'll go back in with more detail later. Now for the bear's body. By now you're starting to get used to this wet and wet technique. Once again, pre-wet your paper. I'm just filling in the entire area inside of the pencil markings of the bear's body with clean water. Don't worry if some of the background color overlaps. Again, the bear is the darkest subject in the whole painting, so it's okay if some of that overlap happens. We're going to cover it up with darker paint anyway. All right, so with the bear nice and wet, but no puddles, you can see I'm scooping some of that water back out where maybe some puddles were forming. Once again, I'm going to mix up some burnt umber, mixing in some water and just making the paint nice and juicy, and rubbing my brush against the palette to remove any excess. And I'm dropping the paint right in on the back of the bear. You can see I'm painting almost up to that pencil line, swooping right next to it. And because we allowed the water to extend a little bit beyond the bear's back, the paint is fuzzing out and blending nicely. Here I've got some indigo on my brush and I'm painting with that right in between the two legs, mixing it with the burnt umber. When you want to go much darker with your paint, do a rich combination of your indigo and burnt umber and you'll get black. And the more indigo you mix in, the more bluish the color will look. And of course, the more brown you add, the more brownish it will look. That's why I like this combination for black, especially for an animal like this, which is a mixture of black and brown. It allows me to control that ratio. So right there on the top of the leg, you can see I did a little more brown instead of the black, and we'll be able to see that subtle color change as it begins to dry. Filling in the toes. And you can see I've left some of that lighter brown untouched. But I'm painting my dark, dark color right up next to it. And this is allowing us to see where there are maybe lighter patches of fur right next to the darker patches of fur. Because we pre-wet the paper, the colors are blending wet and wet right into each other. Here I'm adding a little bit of fur texture by taking my brush and pulling it outward in these short, quick brush strokes. For the forearm, I'm applying some brown with a little bit of the indigo mixed in. You can see I'm painting really quickly. A little bit more black right under the chin, using more indigo in the mixture. And I'm taking that dark black on my brush and pulling out some fur texture under the belly, darkening those back toes, and tightening up the shape along the tree branch. Here I'm adding a first layer of black on the toes, carefully painting around the claws. You'll want to leave those a little bit lighter. Leave them white for now. We'll go back in with more of a mid-tone color for the claws once the black has dried. I've rinsed my brush slightly, so I have a lighter value on my brush, and I'm filling in these highlights in between the toes. And then I'm pulling out some more bark shapes using that black that's on my brush. Rinsing. And I'm taking more water on the head as the head is already dried, so we're going to re-wet that whole thing. Of course, feel free to switch to a smaller brush if you feel like the size 8 is too big for the details on the head. You'll notice I'm painting around the eyes for now. We'll come back to those. All right, I'm mixing up some more indigo and burnt umber and painting a solid dark brownish black in the inside of the ears. And then swiping my brush along the side of the head, filling in the other ear. And swiping along the other side of the head. You might need to twist and turn your brush to maintain a nice sharp point. And I'm using more brown in my mixture for the top of the head. And pulling that color down into the center of the face. More brown on my brush. Swiping along the left side of the head. And then using a little pokey motion with my brush. Just to get some of that, encourage some of that fur texture to come out along the edge. You can see I'm just scrubbing side to side and getting all that nice fur texture. I'm going to darken on the side of the face, just so it looks a little more separated from the body. And then using a little bit more watered down gray and alternating that with some burnt sienna now in my brush for the center of the head. Because the face is the focal point, you're going to want to slow down here and paint a little more carefully. You can see I really watered down my paint for the middle of the head. The muzzle is the lightest section on the bear, so don't go too dark with this too soon. Use a nice washed down layer of your brown, or you can use burnt umber or burnt sienna or yellow ochre. And take that watered down paint up and around the eyes. Those little areas that we drew on with the eyebrows are lighter in value. So you have a light patch of fur right above the eyes. Paint lightly with watered down paint right there. Now you can continue to darken on the inside of the head. In the forehead there, it's much darker. And I'm painting around the eyes. You can see I've slowed down here. I've switched to a slightly smaller brush and I'm using more controlled motions. Working carefully with the very tip of my round brush. Painting in this dark shadow shape in the nose. Still not pitch black just yet. We'll go darker with the next layer. And you can see I painted around the nostrils for now and left a highlight across the top. I'm filling in those nostrils just a little bit with light colored paint. And then for those little toes, those little claws, I'm using watered down burnt umber and burnt sienna. It's kind of a reddish brown, and just painting those in rather loosely. Coming back into the face, I've got more of that brown on my brush. You'll notice I have to control how much water is on there. I'm frequently dipping it in the water, but also dabbing on paper towels so that it doesn't get all that water across my paper. Too much water always equals zero control. So you have to control your water on your brush by dabbing it on paper towels or just a rag that you have around. Really darkening up under the mouth and under the eyes. Filling in once again between those legs with a dark black. If you guys are finding this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up. That really helps me out as a creator, helps me to continue to make great content for free like this for you guys. So thanks for that. And also subscribe if you're new here and hit the notification button so you never miss any new videos. I'm using some black to articulate the shape of that little leg curving. And you'll notice I use short, quick brush strokes for fur texture along those edges. By now we're painting wet on dry, so anything that you put down on the dry paper is just going to stay the way you put it. I'm switching to a tiny size 2 round brush and re-wetting my indigo. It's time to paint those tiny little details. So here I'm painting little dark shadows between the claws. Adding some nostrils. And sort of outlining the nose. And then painting in a dark shadow right in the middle. I've watered my brush down a little bit. And now I'm painting in the eyes. When you're painting eyes, something that will make them look very lifelike is if you leave a highlight. They are, after all, shiny and reflective, so painting a little highlight will help that look much more realistic. To do that, all you have to do is paint around a tiny circle inside of the eyes. And so you can see I'm avoiding this little circle in the center of that eye. And I'm also leaving the whites of the eyes exposed for now. They're too bright, they will need to go darker, but this is where we're starting. We're going to do the same thing with the other eye. I'm filling in the top part of the eye first, and then carefully painting around the whites of the eyes on the edges and the little highlight in the center, leaving that untouched. It looks a little bit unnatural now because that eye is so starkly black against the head, so I'm taking a mid-tone and creating some fur texture in a slightly lighter value, which is helping meld the eyes to the head. Another dark brown, defining the shape of the muzzle, and adding one more wash across the surface of the muzzle. Now to fill in the whites of the eyes, I'm using burnt sienna, and it's looking a little bit more natural now. I'm also creating more of a mid-tone across the top of the eye, and again filling in the white of the eye. I'm covering those highlights across the eye with a light gray. I didn't want them to look too stark white. And then adding another wash across the top of the nose. Filling in that little light shape that was just too bright. All right, moving on to the tree. I just have my indigo and my burnt umber, and I'm switching back to my size 8 brush, and I'm holding my brush almost flat against the table, so it's at a very slight angle, and this is allowing me to create a straight edge and then a blurry edge right next to that. So I'm just dragging my brush across the surface of the dry paper and wiggling a little bit. This is creating some really interesting bark-like textures across the surface of the paper. Mix up your colors, go back and forth between more blue tones and more brown tones. For now, I have the indigo in my brush, and this is helping paint the darker values on the surface of the bark. And now I'm mixing in a little bit more of that cobalt teal blue. Almost makes it look like there are lichens growing on the surface of the bark, like you see in the reference photo. Darkening up that background shape. So you can see that you can make bark look realistic while also painting loosely and expressively. Quick brush strokes, just moving in the direction that the bark is grooving up and down. And this is best done wet on dry. If you want to catch all the texture of that paper and you don't want it to go anywhere, definitely use wet paint on a dry surface. I'm going to mix in some burnt sienna for some more reddish browns here and there. Just aim for a nice harmonious design. And there is our baby bear painting. I hope you guys enjoyed this, and if you tried it, I'd love to see it. Just tag me on Instagram at @eolsonart. And I'll check it out. Thanks so much for watching.